Oh, looks like it is. So this is getting set up. All right, wonderful. We are good to go. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next workshop in our virtual ministry fair, Servants of the Spirit, Gifts for Ministry. Before we begin, I would like to thank Ms. Ada Ramirez for providing Spanish translation for today's session. There is no default language, so please be sure to click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen and select either English or Spanish. Buenos días y bienvenidos. Por favor, todos deben hacer clic en el icono. Just lost my script. Todos deben hacer clic en el icono de interpretación en la parte inferior de su pantalla y seleccionar inglés o español. Gracias. And now that
Pero
I say
no
that, I don't.
se ve. It's not actually there. The interpretation.
Yeah, I just realized that. Thank you for pointing that out. I need to get that started. So I'm going to do that real quick. Now, why is that not working? Bear with me just a moment. Ada, are you able to start the interpretation? I'm having a hard time with this. I don't know what's going on. It's not showing you as being here.
Not on my side.
Oh, you changed your name. That's why. There we go.
Oh,
there we go.
There we
I've
go.
started it now. Okay. Sorry for the wait, everybody. So go ahead and click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select English or Spanish. Thank you all for bearing with me. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Samantha Wiley, and I'm the convention coordinator for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. This morning, we are joined by the Reverend Michele Racusin, CFO of the Diocese of California, for part 2 of our 2-part training for Treasurers Workshop series. As a reminder, this session is being live streamed on the Diocesan Facebook page and YouTube channel, and the recording will remain available for viewing on demand. A link to that video, along with the resources presented, will also be available on the EDLA Convention website at www.diocesanconvention.com. At this time, I ask everyone to please mute yourselves. Anytime you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and we'll pause throughout the presentation to answer them in the order asked. And now it is my pleasure to turn it to our Bishop Suffragan, Bishop Diane Bruce, for opening prayer.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's so exciting to be able to join together with the Diocese of California and the Diocese of Los Angeles to share this great information. And since I became an Episcopalian in the Diocese of California, I'm very excited to have you all with us today. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious and Holy One, we give you thanks for this time. We give you thanks for this day. Give us open hearts and minds to hear and inwardly digest all the information that Michele will impart to us. And may we always, as we care for the assets that you have given us, may we do so prayerfully, joyfully, and always with a mind to do the right thing for the right people at the right time. All this we ask and give thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thank you. And now I turn it to you, Reverend Michele.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. I'm hoping that you, so can you see, did I set it up right, Samantha?
Yes, looks good.
Good. Okay. All my practicing paid off here. 3 steps and I got it right. So welcome to the second part of our Treasurers Update. At this time, we're going to talk about fraud, internal controls, how to substantiate expenses, and discretionary funds. So as we begin, I want you to get ready to put your answer in the chat. I'm going to show you a number and you tell me what you think this number represents. And it's not the national debt. That's your hint. What do you think this number represents? Just put it in the chat box.
$63 billion. What does that represent? Annual fraud, embezzled funds, assets of the Episcopal Church in the U.S., church debts.
Church debts. This is actually the number of the amount of fraud in the Christian the Christian, not other faith communities, the Christian faith community each year. It's a global number, but $63 billion. That is just an astounding number. And I want you to think for 1 second, what could we have done with those funds for the glory of God? Here's some other statistics. The average church loss due to fraud is $120,000. $120,000. Now, there are smaller frauds, of course. This is an average number. But I want you to think in terms of taking a $20 bill off the top of an offering plate is a fraud. These things are totally preventable. Nearly 1/3 of all congregations will fall victim to a fraud. And I bet you $1 that that's a higher number, because it's very difficult to catch a lot of the smaller frauds, especially in a church. The average fraud lasts about 18 months before it's detected. 18 months. And about 80% of church fraud cases don't get reported. Church theft is often from your most trusted people, okay? These are the people that have been there a long time. It's the treasurer who takes the books home to work on them. It's the person who has bank statements delivered to their homes, and then they reconcile the bank accounts.
Clarify, when you say fraud, do you mean theft?
Theft is a fraud. Fraud is oftentimes a plan to deceive, but what you're doing is you're converting the church assets to personal use. And very importantly, that the thieves are only as good as the financial controls over the church resources. So I want to look at this for just a moment. You know, I made a career in public accounting, and I worked for the largest firms in the world. In my tenure, which spanned a couple decades, I was aware of two frauds, and that's a lot of companies. It took me 1 month working in the church to discover my first fraud. And fraud in churches is just rampant. And while the average loss is $120,000, there are others that are even larger. And most church frauds, once they're discovered, are devastating to churches. I mean, think about your reputational loss. Think about how your congregations react when there's been a fraud. The other thing is that we look at this, and we talked about this coming from some of the most trusted people in the church. It oftentimes starts with someone, I mean, people who steal from churches typically, not always, but typically are not your career criminals. There's been an opportunity and they've taken advantage of it. And oftentimes they start really small. They'll start small, they'll be scared, but they got away with it. Then they'll try again, and they'll do it again and again, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Fortunately, we have the means to really protect ourselves against almost all fraud. We really do. So if we have good internal controls, we're going to lessen the chance that this is going to happen to us. Let's look and see a little bit about what causes fraud. We have what's called a fraud triangle. And so what this is there's three aspects to fraud. One of the aspects is pressure. This is where an individual may find themselves with a lot of medical debts. They may find themselves in the midst of a divorce, and they feel that they need money, and the church is an easy target. Sometimes people have a gambling problem, a drug addiction. Sometimes it's just greed. Oftentimes it's living beyond their means. And so this pressure is something that contributes to their ability and they're wanting to steal. People who steal oftentimes will rationalize what they're doing. So this is the second aspect of this fraud triangle. Let's say, well, and this is typically an honest person, but the opportunity presents itself, the controls aren't in place, and say, well, I'm just going to borrow this. I need $20 for my kids' soccer treat today. I need this, but I'm going to pay it back. I'll pay it back. Or it could be someone who says, I haven't gotten a raise in a long time. And so I'm just going to kind of even the score here. And a lot of it has to do also, the third part is opportunity. The opportunity presents itself. It's just so easy. That $20 bill laying right on top of that offering plate, it is so easy. I could just pick that off. Nobody will ever notice. And I can tell you a lot of stories about that involve these aspects of the fraud triangle. I mean, there's the story of the musician, the church musician, who's married to the church administrator, and he does a wedding. And so what happens is they ask the people from the wedding to pay the musician directly. And so they pay him cash for services. And then what happens? The church administrator writes him a check for the services. And that kind of stuff is hard to find. That's why you have to have the structure in place, the rules in place. There's the story of the ECW president, trusted person, pillar of the community. She would never do anything wrong. She guarded those church assets like they were her own, and everything was in her home. The bank statements went to her home. The books and records were at her home. She controlled all the checks. She wrote the checks. She signed the checks. She did the recs. Well, guess what? Not everything ended up in the coffers of the church. And there's other things where you need more people involved. There's the story of the church administrator who was a good friends with the church treasurer. Pledge cards came in. They together were the only two eyes that saw them. They recorded them, and guess what? The church administrator wanted a raise. And so the pledges were inflated. So there was enough money to give the church administrator a raise. Of course, that didn't last long. So this fraud triangle is really important because this gives you the opportunity to kind of understand the mind and what goes into actually committing a fraud, and the rationalization that allows these people to commit a fraud and then to continue committing that fraud. So what can we do about this? It's not a lost cause. Really, we have a lot of control over this. And here's one of the things that helps prevent fraud: having good internal controls. So what are internal controls? Well, internal controls are the mechanisms, the rules and regulations, that the policies and procedures that go behind protecting the church's assets. But just as importantly, how many volunteers who are honest are going to want to work in your congregation if they are not protected by good internal controls, right? So the good internal controls protect the church against theft and misappropriations. They protect your volunteers and employees against being wrongfully accused of something. And it gives the congregation some assurance that these assets are being taken care of. What happens to a congregation when a fraud happens? How do you overcome the loss of trust? How do you keep people in the pews? How do you keep them making contributions? It's a vicious cycle. And so we have to work hard as faith communities to prevent this from happening in the first place. If you take nothing else away from this seminar, please remember this. It's the segregation of duties, it's the separation of duties. And no matter how small you are, this is a non-negotiable. So, and it's really simple. If you touch money, you can't post transactions or reconcile accounts. If you post transactions or record the transactions, you don't touch money or reconcile accounts. And if you reconcile the accounts, you don't touch money or record it. So you've got these three legs and they never touch. And this is part of what keeps you safe. And as you look at these, this separation of duties, these three independent wheels that are held together by the church's assets and this whole system of internal controls, please realize that this can't happen in a vacuum. You have to have the support of church leadership, the rector, the priest in charge. It is not going to be acceptable that the priest steps back, the clergy steps back and says, finances just aren't my gig. Well, you know what? You got to make them your gig. You've got to have a basic understanding, and you've got to stand firm when it comes to separation of duties. This is a non-negotiable. This needs to be implemented and monitored by the vestry, because the vestry is the steward of the church resources. And this needs to be part of your training for all your church volunteers and employees who are involved in any financial aspect of the congregation. I'm going to pause now. Any questions up to this point? You can just put them in the chat and Samantha will read them.
When you were talking about the fraud triangle, the rationalization and opportunity, is the scale of the fraud in the church a sign of the magnitude of the financial need and economic distress experienced by parishioners?
Not necessarily, because you also have the greed factor. And one of the things that I should mention is that oftentimes people who steal from a church will get caught in one church and they'll go to another. And so while most church theft is not perpetrated by career criminals or experienced thieves, there is an aspect of church thievery where people do rotate. And so when you catch someone in a theft, if you talk to their prior congregation, chances are they've had some kind of misappropriation there as well, which is one of the reasons why I believe it's really important to make the follow up with legal action against people who steal, because you're not doing your congregation a favor. You will not do the next congregation a favor by just burying it under a rug.
Okay. How do you separate posting and reconciliation if both require the same accounting application?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what you do is you have one person who actually enters the transaction. So they're the ones who are going to say, okay, the Smiths just paid $20 toward their pledge. But you have a separate person, like the treasurer is a prime person to do this, to actually reconcile the bank account and make sure that all of the accounts, reconcile all of the accounts every month within your financial system. And this is the reason. So you've got the money being collected, right? You've got counters, and they give a count sheet and copies of the checks to the person who inputs everything. They input everything. And then you've got the treasurer reconciling the bank account at the end of the month. If you break down those internal controls, what can happen is, say like the offering is not counted, but it's put in a secure place. The church administrator who does the recording has access to it. He or she slips a $20 bill out of the pile. That $20 bill is the loss of that is not going to go, it's going to go undetected, because you don't know who gave it, and there's no way to trace that it was actually received. Aspect number two, you've got good counters. They put the money in the safe and don't do the deposit. The church administrator who's making the recording slips the $20 bill out, lowers the amount that he or she is inputting into the records by $20, right? No record of the cash, and then reconciles the account, and nobody knows that $20 bill was missing because it never was entered into the books and records and never hit the bank account. So that's why you need to have that separation there.
Okay. And to clarify, the bookkeeper and the treasurer should be two separate people.
Absolutely. You want to have the person who records or posts can't reconcile. Those are two different legs on this stool.
Okay. Do you have suggestions for small parishes, like with less than 40 people or less than 40 average Sunday attendance, where I don't have enough volunteers to separate things?
Yeah, I hear this all the time, but there has to be a way. You've got to do it. And even if you need to outsource one step of that. Now, as far as handling the money, touching the cash receipts, if you have a bishop's committee or vestry and recruit them to be your counters. Okay, so that's one aspect. That's one leg that's taken care of, and every parish or mission can take care of that piece. If you don't have enough people to have someone independent post it, maybe you can outsource it. It may not be that expensive. As far as the reconciliation goes, if you have a treasurer, then that treasurer can reconcile it. So you really, it's not as hard as you think. You really only need your vestry bishops committee, a treasurer, and then a third person.
Okay. And a comment, thank you for being straightforward about this. If everyone just followed procedures and controls without defaulting to friendship and casualness, none of us would need to be thinking about this.
Yeah, it's hard in a church. I mean, that's one of the reasons churches are susceptible to this. It's a kumbaya thing. Everybody loves each other. It's about forgiveness. It's about acceptance. It's about, if somebody wants to work, let them do the job. But you've got to be careful because we're called to be stewards of what we've been given, right? I mean, we're only stewards of this so we can do God's work. And so if we're not using our brains and the systems that are in place, then we've really failed on many aspects of this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Next question. We got a couple more and then we'll continue.
Okay.
Our bookkeeper doesn't like to allow someone else access to the accounting software for fear that they change postings accidentally or on purpose when they're reconciling.
Well, then find a new bookkeeper because that's just not gonna work. And first of all, you never have a system where only one person has access to it. And that's for a variety of reasons. I mean, if the person gets hit by a truck, how do you get into your system? Okay. Number two, it brings you to a really important aspect of choosing your accounting software. I've got a book that I'm going to refer you to at the end of this. It's in the resources. But this person says that when he gets a call and there's been a church fraud, that an overwhelming amount of time, you know what software their church is using? QuickBooks. And why? QuickBooks allows you to make changes and there's no record of those changes. There's no audit trail. And that is a serious weakness of that software. Now, one of the softwares that I've worked with, I really liked, I do recommend, is Church Windows. There is a record, an audit trail of everything that happens. So saying that somebody's going to change something in the system and you're not going to know that happened, well, you can do that with QuickBooks, but you cannot do it with Church Windows. So I would recommend that. And it is more expensive, but you know what? One small fraud and it's paid for itself. So that's just what I would recommend.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with Fund Easy. I don't know that software. So.
We've got a few more questions, but I think they're on topics that you're going to touch on in just a moment. So I'm going to pause questions for right now. And yeah, so let's continue the presentation and we'll go back to those questions that we haven't answered yet.
Okay, so let's just look at an overview of receipts, okay? And I think this is pretty basic. We know that two people need to be present when cash is involved, okay? That's really basic. But I think when we think about that, our mind is going directly to the whole counting process. But most skimming from the offering plate happens not from the time that the counters are touching it. It happens when the offering plates are making their journey from the altar to the counters. And so it's at this point in time where you absolutely have to have two people on it immediately and two people walking those offerings to the place where the counters are going to count. Story. I was involved in a church and had a very eager altar guild person. Now, this person from the time they came in wanted to do two things. One was be an acolyte trainer, and that's going to give you your first clue. And the second one was be in the altar guild. Well, he started and he was on the altar guild. And one of the first things I noticed was that as soon as the procession was leaving the church, going down the aisle, this guy was very concerned about the safety of these offering plates. So he would make a beeline up, take those offering plates, go right into the sacristy and close the sacristy door. Well, you know, the cash that was on the top of those offering plates never made it to the counters. So having cash involved in anything, you need two people from the very beginning, two people. So we ended up having to have two people at the front pew, and they would make a beeline and together would take the plate before he could get to it. So 2 people at all times in all places whenever there's cash involved. All right. You should have your counters. You need to have 2 counters. They need to be rotated. Okay, another true story. Treasurer and church administrator, best friends, pillars of the church, been there forever. Husbands did all kinds of work. Nobody would ever say anything cross to them, because what would ever happen if they left? The whole place would fall apart. And guess what? They were the only counters. And even when they were on vacation and gone for a Sunday, that offering needed to be put into the safe for them to count and deposit on Monday. And guess what? Not all of the cash made it to the bank. It didn't make it to the bank. So you need to have 2 people. The team needs to be rotated, because you can't have any collusion, or you can't have the appearance of collusion. Because remember, the internal controls are not only to protect the cash, they're to protect your people. And your people are far more valuable assets than the cash. And as you're doing this, okay, so you've got the counters, you rotate them, but they also can't be related. And why? It's not that a married couple is gonna steal more often than somebody else, but you don't want to give that appearance either, right? So it's about protecting your people as well. So typically the offerings come in. You've got 2 people. You're running 2 tapes. You're verifying multiple ways that you've got the same total on this deposit. You've got count sheets that are going to go to both the treasurer and your poster, right? So we've got independent ways to verify the amount of that deposit, and you're making copies of the checks. Ideally, that deposit should be dropped at the bank right after it's counted. Okay, having an intermediate step, even if you're putting it in a safe, is just an invitation for something to happen. So it's best to drop it at the bank immediately. Okay, so then the church, the parish administrator, or whoever is takes care of the books, posts these transactions, will post these transactions from copies. They've got check copies, they've got the counting copies, etc. All right, so the other thing is that you want to keep all of these things. You're going to keep that count sheet after it's been verified in a safe place. You should probably shred the checks. If you store those checks and your office is gets broken into, okay, you can scan them and keep them online. But if you keep hard copies of them and you've got a theft at your church, you've got identity theft problems. And this is another true story. Thieves broke into church office. The policy was that all the check copies, they were scanned, kept online, and the documents were shredded. But the system got broken down. Somebody didn't pay attention. The thieves took the paperwork and ended up in a theft ring in another city. So again, you've got reputational damage, because every single parishioner that was pledgers had to be notified that we'd had a breach, that this congregation had a breach. Again, reputational loss. So you have to be so careful with people's information.
So I have a quick question. We're in the pandemic. A lot of the contributions that are coming in right now are checks being mailed or electronic contributions. How does that affect the timing of counting and the process there versus cash in person?
Sure, you can still have counters come on a weekly basis. Okay. The thing about the pandemic, though, is that you're not getting the currency cash for the most part. You're getting checks and electronic payments. Those are more difficult to convert. Okay. But you still have 2 counters, and you can do socially distanced, masks, gloves, etc. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And is there a special rule or anything for online contributions for electronic receipt of contributions?
Yeah. So they come in, and so you've still got they're already deposited. So you've got the person who does the bookkeeping, records them, and then you've got the treasurer who's doing the reconciliation.
Okay,
Nobody's
perfect.
actually touching it. So you've got the two pieces of that. As far as auditors, you are going to scan the copies of those checks, keep them on the cloud. So the auditor will have copies of the deposited checks. What you don't want to have are copies, paper copies that can end up in thieves' hands.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's do a quick overview of the cash disbursements. Okay. So what you want to make sure is that you've got someone who is in the position to approve an invoice when it comes in. And so this approver needs to make sure that the assets, whatever was purchased, actually ended up being used for church purposes. Okay. And that this is something that was budgeted or otherwise approved by the vestry. And they want to check the invoices for accuracy. Okay. And then you've got the parish administrator, the person who's doing the bookkeeping, will verify to make sure that the invoice hasn't been previously paid, assigns your general ledger account number, and can write the check. And then you've got check signers, oftentimes vestry members, who review all the documentation and then sign the check. Now, many disbursements will require two signatures. This is an internal control. Usually the bank doesn't care, but it's an internal control. You can have a policy in your church that all checks over a certain amount need two signatures, okay? And oftentimes that amount is set at maybe like $500. Okay, you're gonna do it something that's meaningful for your church. That having been said, you still have this same procedure, and you've got a check signer who is the final eyes on this whole procedure and approving everything and making sure that everything is in accordance with budget, receive the information, proper vendor, etc. The other check in this whole thing is when the vestry is reviewing financial statements, say like there's a big uptick in supply expense. The vestry would say, why is our supply expense up so high? Now, a legitimate answer would be, oh, we just bought paper. It's for Holy Week bulletins, and it will last us for the next 3 months. That would be a legitimate answer. If you look at it, we have no idea, and you find out that, oh, it's school supplies and it ended up in someone's house, that's a different answer. So you can go back and look at invoices. But what you'll do is you're going to, part of your control as a vestry or a bishop's committee would be in reviewing those financial statements to see, are we close to what we've budgeted? Is there an unusual expenditure? Questions about the disbursement side?
I'm just scrolling back up to see other questions. I think we hit on most of these. If anyone's got a question about disbursements, we talked about software. Oh, you were mentioning outsourcing. Would it be useful to collaborate with other parishes, or could this be organized at the diocesan level, collaborating with other people in your deanery or your diocese?
Yeah, I mean, if it's going to come to the point probably where it's efficient for churches to work together, congregations to work together. So what if several congregations worked together and had one bookkeeper that helped with 3 different congregations? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can be creative and work together. And you guys, you're all very smart people and very clever, and you can figure this out. So yes, collaborate with other people. But just make sure those 3 legs are separate. That just take that piece away. Do not forget that piece. Those 3 things have to be separated.
What kind of documentation is needed for online disbursements? For example, regular utility bills.
Yeah, so you just you pull the invoice off of the internet, right? And it goes to support the expenditure that was made. You scan it and you store it in the cloud under utility bills.
Okay. And what about automatic debits to the account? How does approval take place since the debit is automatic?
Yeah, so automatic debits are going to typically be things like utilities, right? That the routine type expenses is going to be the same thing. You're going to print the documentation. Your treasurer is going to he or she can approve it, that it was a legitimate expenditure. You're going to review financial statements. Do we have unusual blurps, in our expenditures? So a lot of different ways to test that out. I mean, and you're going to make sure that, that it is your bill. It's not going to somebody's house. You're paying electrical for someone's house.
Mm-hmm. What role, if any, should the rector play in the process? I'm in a small church with no parish admin, et cetera, so everyone else involved are volunteers.
Yeah, so as the rector, you need to support and understand the importance of good internal controls. You're not going to be a check signer. You're not going to reconcile accounts. You're not going to input the information, but you are going to be the person who says that this is important. It needs to be enforced. You're going to work with your vestry to make sure that they understand it and that you have policies and procedures in place. And then you're going to support that. And oftentimes you're going to get pushback. And so you need to understand what these controls are and what can and cannot be adjusted. What can and cannot be done. So and it's a huge role. It's a huge role. And if you are in a parish or in a situation and you're getting pushback and it's someone who is one of the the pillars of your congregation, if you need me to make a phone call, to explain internal controls, to attend a vestry meeting, I'm a phone call or an email away. And I mean that. So I will be your strong person.
And just to clarify, how far does support extend into review for a rector or vicar?
Well, you're supporting the process, right? I'm not sure what you mean by review. I mean, you're going to be part of the presentation of financial statements, so you're going to be able to see those blurbs. If you've got a question, you just go and say, hey, I would like to see the supporting documentation for this. Or you can sit down, you should be sitting down with your treasurer on a routine basis anyway and going over things. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Okay. So if you have a follow-up question on that one, go ahead and put that in the chat. And then I've just got a couple of questions about the rector signing checks. Someone was asking, can they sign checks? And then someone else said that they're surprised that they're not a signer. We're a small church and our rector has always been the main backup for as a check signer.
As a rector, I'd never sign a check. You've got 12 vestry members, 10 vestry members. You should have at least 4 of them as check signers. You should be able to get 2 signatures. Stay away from signing checks if you're the rector.
Okay, so that's it for questions for now. So let's continue.
Okay. All right. So let's look at some other areas that require some vigilance. Oh, shoot, I went too far. Okay, expense reimbursement. This is a high risk area. So what you'll want to do as a congregation is you need to have a policy. What is our policy to reimburse expenses? What kinds of expenses do we reimburse? What is the budget for a particular a line item? Okay, you'll need to have receipts before you write a check to reimburse somebody. If someone calls and they say, well, so-and-so doesn't give receipts or blah, blah. There are places where you're going to have to use your discretion, but 9 times out of 10, well, more than that, they should have receipts. They'll have some kind of electronic means of getting them to you. You need receipts. I'm going to get to the documentation required in just a minute. Travel and entertainment, another place of a lot of abuse. You need policies and procedures that explain what types of entertainment will be reimbursable. And this includes the use of alcohol. Do you, as a congregation, reimburse a glass of wine with dinner? Okay, maybe not a big deal, but you need to have a policy so that people understand before they go to dinner, all right? And you can look at your diocesan policies with respect to the use of alcohol also. You'll need to make sure that the travel is something that the vestry has already approved via the budget. So, for example, EBAC, you may send your a couple members of your congregation or your administrator to a church conference to learn about benefits or to learn about pensions or something else that benefits the congregation. So the thing is that you need to have an understanding in advance. You need to make sure that you have the receipts to back up any kind of reimbursement. You also want to have policies with respect to the type of travel you're going to reimburse. All right. So can somebody drive their car if it's cheaper to take the train? Are we going to reimburse a first class plane ticket, or is everybody required to fly coach? So just think through those things. What are your policies so that you can make sure that you're being good stewards and that people understand beforehand? Now, there is documentation that's required by the Internal Revenue Service. And part of that documentation surrounds the meals. Okay. If you're going to a conference and you are just, paying for your breakfast, that's one thing. If you're taking someone out, so say like the clergy is taking someone out for a pastoral call and they have lunch, there are things that need to be documented in order for that to be reimbursed. One, what is the purpose of the meeting, of the lunch? Now, it's not saying, well, I was talking to Mary and she's getting a divorce and blah, blah, blah. No, pastoral visit. Okay. The name and business relationships, you could just say, Joe Blow, parishioner, and, Mark Pound, clergy person. The amount will be on there. Purpose, did I leave anything out? Name, purpose, type, relationship, yeah, and the amount. So that is really important. And of course, you've got to hand in a receipt. Now, you could say like somebody paid a cash tip. That would be normal. Like if you're in a hotel room, you leave a tip for the help, your room service. You can leave a cash tip. It needs to be reasonable. All right. So if someone's leaving $100 tip, that probably is not reasonable. If they're leaving a $5 or $10 tip, that is reasonable. They won't have a receipt for that. So you have to think some of these things through. Okay. The use of debit or credit cards. This is not, many of you are not going to like this, but this is highly not recommended. Okay. There is so much fraud around the use of debit and credit cards. And the reality is that you probably don't need to have a church credit card. And why not? Someone goes out, they make an authorized purchase, an authorized meal, authorized something with their personal credit card. Immediately you turn around and write them a check to reimburse it. You just need proper documentation, right? They hand in an expense report, they hand in a check request. It goes through the same procedure that we talked about before with disbursements. There's no need for you to have your own credit card. There really isn't. So I would strongly discourage the use of a debit or credit card at the church level, a congregation level. Last thing on this list, petty cash. Very common for churches to have petty cash. Petty cash is always going to be short. I can guarantee it. You can be as diligent as you want, but you're going to have shortages with it. Again, think hard before you have a petty cash account. Why do you really need it? Why do you really need it? So just one more area that you can have difficulties with. All right, questions about these 5 items?
Yes. How about handling online purchases? For example, supplies, online merchants like Amazon. Yep. Another question about Amazon. Usually you have a debit or a credit card that you're using for online purchases. Is there another way to do it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, have the person use their own credit card and immediately get reimbursed for it. In fact, if you're doing it that way, they're getting reimbursed before their bill even comes. So it's not like they're having to front the money. You know what I mean? So again, and online purchases are more and more common, and they're often cheaper. So absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. And then another question about that. It doesn't seem reasonable to have that go through my private account if I'm the rector. Yeah.
Well, why not?
That was the extent of the question. pouring in debit cards using for online services. So you're saying that you should use a private account or a private card and then reimburse the person making the purchase?
Yep.
Okay. What if your administrator doesn't have a credit card?
Well, then have somebody else make the purchase with their credit card.
Can you be more specific about the problems that it causes to have a church card?
Yeah, so it's open for unauthorized purchases because it's easy. I mean, that's the main thing. And then you're stuck. And it is just a source of constant abuse. It's a problem you don't need.
A recent visit from a diocesan auditor suggested a church credit card versus using the rector's personal card. But then someone said, as a rector, I pay my online services using my own credit card and submit quarterly for reimbursement. So
that's fine. I mean, look at
there's some division here.
Well, okay, it's no different than you go out and you're taking someone to lunch and you pay it on your personal credit card and you submit it for reimbursement. The important part is that it's a budgeted expense, that the vestry has authorized it via the financial statements, right? They know that they've got Zoom coming in, they know that Constant Contact's coming in, and then they submit for reimbursement. It goes through your whole procedure, all the eyes see it, it gets approved, it's authorized, the check gets written, or ACH payment, the treasurer approves it, it's in the financial statements, the vestry reviews it. And you're reimbursed with all of the documentation that's required. You've got your receipts, and you hand those in for reimbursement.
Okay, that looks like it so far for questions on that. Someone else asked, going back to the topic of reconciliation, is it sufficient for the treasurer to review the reconciliation report after the fact, or do they have to do the process themselves?
They should do the process themselves, but you could have another person do the reconciliation and the treasurer review it. You just don't want the person who's doing the posting to be the person who does the reconciliation.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So that's it for questions for now.
Okay. All right. So we have 10 minutes left. I'm going to start going through the discretionary funds. I'm going to do part of it a little quickly, but there's part that I'm going to slow down on because this is a source of multiple misappropriations and a lot of misunderstanding. So let's look at discretionary funds. First of all, just remember that it's authorized by canons. The canons state that it's loose offerings one Sunday a month, and that it's used for charitable and pious purposes. So your sources for this may be loose offering from at least one Sunday Eucharist a month. Okay, so by loose offering, that means that there are funds that aren't pledges or otherwise directed for some other means, okay, specific means. So this one Sunday a month, when you have a Eucharist, you end up with cash and checks that are not pledges, and they're not for a specific fund, a designated fund. It can also be a budgeted line item. There's many churches who don't get enough loose offerings on one Sunday a month to adequately fund a discretionary fund. And so it can also, in addition to the one Sunday a month, be a budgeted line item. The vestry may, or Bishops' Committee may have a policy that designates all of the gifts or fees received from baptisms, weddings, and funerals go to the discretionary fund. And occasionally people will write a check or make an offering specifically for the discretionary fund. There's a part that I'm gonna elaborate on some of this stuff in a few minutes. So I'm gonna kind of go through these slides a little quicker. Okay, accounting for discretionary funds. The vestry is the one who approves the checking accounts for a parish period. Okay, these funds, all checking accounts need to be in the congregation name, which means that if you have a discretionary fund, you do not put it in the name of your cleric. It's in the congregation's name. And this is super important for a number of reasons, okay? Not the least of which is that if you mess this up, all of this money in this fund becomes taxable to the rector. So if for no other reason, keep it straight because of that. A lot of other reasons as well. It's under the church ID number, okay? Not the rector's social security number. It is subject to audit. This is huge. Many people think that it's a private account where nobody can look at it because everything in there is super sensitive and there's confidentiality, et cetera. Every dollar that comes into the church is subject to the audit, and that includes the discretionary fund. That fund is kept on the church financial statements. It is not a secret account that's squirreled away and only the rector knows about it. It is on the church financial statements. And when the cleric leaves the congregation, that fund belongs to the church. It does not belong to the cleric. Okay, this is super important. A lot of people don't know this. It stays with the congregation. It is not the personal property of the cleric. It stays with the congregation. Oftentimes people ask, how many bank accounts do I need? Should I have a separate bank account for the discretionary fund? So there's two schools of thought here, and I have a strong opinion, which I know you want me to share with you. The first one is that you keep it in the general, you keep the funds, the cash, in your general operating account. Okay, so the way this works is you have everything in there. You have a separate accounting for it on your balance sheet, right? You've got a fund that's called, like on your balance sheet, you've got Altar Guild Fund, perhaps, or Flower Fund, or Oregon Fund. Rector's Discretionary Fund is one of those line items. That's how you know how much is in there. But the cash is all kept in your general operating fund. So the cleric makes a disbursement, pays a utility bill, for example, whatever you're spending your money on for the good of the order there. And you just turn it in as an expense reimbursement like you do everything else, okay? The second way to do it is to have a completely separate checking account. Again, the vestry has to approve this account, but all the deposits are made to the general checking account. This protects the cleric from having anything converted to taxable income. So you put the deposits into the general fund and then you transfer it to the separate checking account. Yeah, so you don't put anything directly into it, and it's on the financial statements. And again, you're not going to commingle any funds anyway. So let's look at the next thing. Oh, and I forgot to share my very important opinion. I'm really of the school, you need to keep things simple. Put everything in a general checking account fund. Don't have separate checking accounts for the discretionary fund. That's my personal opinion. Okay, so, and I think we've gone through this. You've got to have written documentation for reimbursements. You've got to have appropriate receipts. You've got to have the purpose. If you have a separate checking account fund, like everything else, the bank statement is mailed to the church, right? And not to the cleric's home. You've got someone that's going to verify the deposits, review your checks, reconcile the accounts, etc. If you have someone who comes in and needs money to pay their electric bill, ideally you'll just go online and you'll pay it for them. You'll make the payment directly to the utility company. Oftentimes, someone will come in and they'll need money for groceries. Oftentimes, you can make an arrangement with a grocery store, a gas station, or hotel in advance for payment, or you can go with them and make the payment. And occasionally, you may give some cash. You'll need to document that really well, but please don't make that a habit. There's much better ways of doing it than just handing out cash. Let's look at some of the expenditures and see what you think what's okay and what's not. So can you use the rector's discretionary fund, a cleric's discretionary fund to pay for food, rent, utilities, medical bills for congregation members? Just real quickly, put in the chat, yes or no. This is helping out congregation members.
No, yes, 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 no, yes, yes, no.
Okay, all right. So actually, yes, you can. You can use this for all of these things for congregation members, as well as for community members. Oftentimes people think, oh no, I can only do this for someone who walks in off the street. But you absolutely can do it for congregation members. Of course, you have to use your own discretion. can you make a payment for either budgeted or non-budgeted operating expenses from your discretionary fund? So budgeted or non-budgeted operating expenses. Yes or no?
I'm getting a lot of no's.
Yeah, so the discretionary fund is not used for operating expenses. That is not the purpose of that. So church runs low on cash, needs to pay its electric bill. No, that's not the purpose of the discretionary fund. Can you use your discretionary fund to pay for a conference expense? Yes or no?
I'm getting some no's.
Yeah, no. And why? That's an operating expense, right? That's a budgeted line item. That's something that you're paying for out of operations. What about paying for vestments?
Getting some more no's.
Yeah. So again, I mean, that's a budgeted line item. What about religious books used by the congregation?
Some more no's.
Yeah, because again, that's an operating expense. Now let me be clear. You're holding a study group, and everybody has to buy a book, and there's 3 people who can't afford to buy a book. Well, that's not an operating expense, right? So yes, you can use your discretionary fund to help out these attendees. But what you want to stay away from is it's not used for operations. All right. Here are some prohibited uses. Personal clothing for the cleric, food for the cleric, rent for the cleric, books for the cleric, utilities for the cleric, medical insurance or expenses for the cleric. You get the picture. If it benefits the cleric, you cannot use a discretionary fund expenditure for the cleric. No way. This is huge. This is how clergy get themselves in trouble. It looks bad. It is bad. It is not for you. It is not your money. It is for the good of other people in need. So keep that in mind. If it benefits you as a cleric, do not even think about it, okay? And this happens, and it's ugly, and it makes the headlines, and we want to stay away from this. This is something that's really detrimental to churches.
Does that include the cleric's family, real quick?
Yeah, it does. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Here are some tax consequences. Okay. Okay, so gifts made to the discretionary fund, it's accountable to the vestry. Those are deductible to the person making that donation. If a person makes a contribution to your discretionary fund and they say, but it's for so-and-so, okay? So for example, a parishioner comes to you and they say, I know that so-and-so just lost their job. It's Christmas. I would like to donate $500 so that this person can buy Christmas gifts for their family. All right. I mean, it sounds so wonderful, right? And this person needs Christmas gifts for their family. And you don't want to just go directly and say, hey, here's $500. I know that you're down and out, and my family wants to make sure you have a good Christmas. Okay. If you're donating specifically for another person, that is not deductible to the person making the donation. You can do it, you just can't take a deduction for it. All right. Why did this come into effect? Well, you can thank the Mormons for this, because what happened to Mormons? They made donations to the church to send their children on mission trips, right? And so the IRS stepped in and they say, not so fast. You're not going to do that. So we have this blanket ruling that if you're saying I'm donating for someone for a seminary, I'm donating for the specific person for whatever, that is not going to be tax deductible to you. I'm tax deductible to the person making the donation. Okay, here's one that's super important, and a lot of people don't know this one. You are the rector, or you're the cleric. You've got an employee, and I mean they need some help, right? And who doesn't want to help your own employees, to help your own parishioners? Well, here's the deal: if that person is an employee, you can make a donation to them, pay an expense to them out of your discretionary fund, but because they're an employee, it becomes taxable compensation. And you need to put that amount on their W-2 form and withhold Social Security, okay? So keep that in mind, super important. All right, it is now 10 o'clock. I wanna be respectful of time. I am going to skip just a couple things here. We'll have other seminars. if you have an idea for a webinar, please put it in the chat, and we can think about getting that for you in a future time. Here's some resources. You can email me at michelleR@diocal.org. You can email the Diocese of Los Angeles at finance@ladiocese.org. Remember that one of the most important documents you can have in your church to understand the workings of the church financially is the Manual of Business Methods. It's free. It's in English. It's in Spanish, and these slides will be available, so you can catch up on this later. But there is an amazing book called Financial Management for Episcopal Churches. It's written by James Jordan. You can get it on Amazon. It is the best book that I have seen for understanding internal controls, and it has flowcharts in it. So say like you go, you know what, I'm just not understanding some of the intricacies of how the money should flow or how I should do disbursements and keep good internal controls. This book has flowcharts in it. So I highly recommend that book. Okay. Any just closing questions real quick?
One question we did get about discretionary funds. If you've got leftover funds at the end of the year, does that carry over to the next year?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how do we report donations to employees to Diocal, which is our paymaster?
Wait a minute. How do we say that again?
The question is, if we give a discretionary fund donation to an employee, Diocal in our case manages all of our payroll. How does that? Yeah.
Okay, sorry, like a complete disconnect there. Yeah, just send us the documentation. Send it to Sarah. You know Sarah, or you can send it to me too. But Sarah's the one who will take care of that. But yes,
perfect.
Thank you. Great question.
Okay. All right, we've got a lot of thanks in the chat. But yeah, as a reminder, the recording of this video will remain available on EDLA's Facebook and YouTube page. I'll also be posting a link to the recording on the EDLA convention website at www.diocesanconvention.com. We'll also have a copy of the slides there and links to the resources that Reverend Michele just talked about. We will likely host another session of this. This is very valuable information. This has been wonderful. So we'll probably do another one. And if you have any questions specific to your church or your diocese, make sure to email your diocesan finance office. If you're in Diocal, that's michelleR@diocal.org. If you're in EDLA, that's finance@ladiocese.org. And just thank you so much, Reverend Michele. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We look forward to seeing you again, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.